I've always been told I was too sensitive. That's what my sister Solara used to say, rolling her eyes whenever I noticed small details she wanted others to ignore. But sometimes being sensitive keeps you alive. That thought echoed in my mind the evening we gathered for dinner at my late father's house in Portland. My mother, Orlana, insisted it was important to keep traditions, even if the family felt fractured since Dad passed. I agreed, though part of me knew Solara wanted the night less for memories and more for appearances. The dining room hadn't changed since childhood. The same oak table, the same mismatched chairs Dad refused to replace because, as he said, they've held us long enough, they'll hold us still. A fire crackled in the old brick hearth. It should have been comforting, but I felt like the warmth was pushing shadows closer rather than pushing them away. Dorian, Solara's fiancé, arrived with 2 bottles of wine tucked under his arm. He carried himself with the easy charm of a man who believed everyone was already impressed with him. My mother thanked him politely. I managed to smile, though something about the way he handled those bottles, like trophies, made me uneasy. As we settled around the table, I kept my posture straight, listening. Forks clinked against plates. Conversation floated around about work, the weather, the rising prices at the grocery store. Everything sounded normal, but there was a hum beneath it, like the buzz of a faulty wire. I sipped water, listening more than speaking. Dorian rose. "I thought tonight called for something special," he announced. He uncorked the darker bottle with a flourish. "This vintage, it's bold, smooth. You'll taste the care in every sip." He poured first for Solara, then for my mother, and finally for me. His hand lingered slightly longer over my glass, tilting just enough that the wine swirled and frothed more than the others. I noticed but said nothing, watching his eyes. He smiled as if testing me. I lifted the glass, catching Solara watching too closely, lips parted in expectation. I took a sip. It wasn't awful at first, just a bit more bitter than it should have been, like a metallic undertone hidden beneath fruit. My instinct clenched immediately. Something was wrong. "You should try this vintage, Mars," Dorian said smoothly, his voice silk over stone. "It's strong but smooth. Trust me, it's unforgettable." Trust, a word that sticks to the roof of your mouth when used by the wrong person. Solara tilted her head. "See? Doesn't he have good taste?" I forced a small smile. "It's unique." Inside, I thought, did I imagine that taste? Or did he slip something in? The lesson drilled into every American woman echoed in my head. Never leave your drink unattended. Never accept one from a stranger. But what happens when the danger comes from the people sitting at your family table? The rest of dinner blurred. I laughed at my mother's stories, responded when Solara prodded, but my mind circled that glass. Each sip I pretended to take was a small performance. My lips wet, but my throat dry. My stomach knotted, not from food, but from suspicion. That night, long after dishes were stacked in the sink and goodbyes exchanged, I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling. My pulse throbbed unevenly, pounding at my temples. My chest felt tight, my heart racing like it was running a marathon I hadn't trained for. I sat up, clutching the blanket. This wasn't just nerves, something had entered my system. By morning, the pounding headache was still there. Dizziness hit when I stood, forcing me to grip the dresser. My hands shook as I drove to the doctor's office, telling myself maybe it was the flu, maybe stress. The doctor ran tests, blood work, the usual. The results came back vague, trace elements, nothing conclusive. "Could be anything," he said kindly. "Sometimes tests just don't tell us the whole story." I nodded, but inside I heard another truth. Doctors can't always prove betrayal. Sometimes your gut is the only evidence you have. Walking back to my car, the Portland air bit at my face. My hands tightened on the steering wheel before I even started the engine. I wasn't just paranoid. Something was happening. But how could I tell anyone without sounding unhinged? That evening, I sat with my mother in her living room, tea steaming between us. I opened my mouth twice to tell her, then closed it again. She looked tired enough, lines deeper around her eyes, her body shrinking in the armchair she once shared with Dad. I thought, if I tell her I think Dorian tried to drug me, Will she believe me? Or will she sigh, pat my hand, and say, "You're too sensitive, Marceline"? Silence weighed. I stood frozen in my bedroom doorway. The jewelry box on top of my dresser sat slightly crooked, and the small velvet pouch where I always tucked the safe key was open. I touched the pouch with 2 fingers, as if expecting the metal to magically appear, but the space was empty. For years, I had never moved that key from its hiding place. I could almost hear my father's voice in my head. "Locks don't just protect valuables, Marcy, they protect your peace of mind." But the key was gone, and my peace left with it. I tore through my drawers, checked the floor, even lifted the rug. Nothing. Keys don't sprout legs. Someone had been inside this room. And the thought of that, the idea of fingers rifling through my private belongings, sent a wave of anger stronger than fear. I couldn't shake the bitter taste of Dorian's wine from my mouth. And now this. Americans like me grow up being told to lock doors, to hide spare keys, to trust that metal and wood are enough. But when the lock itself is in someone else's hand, you realize security isn't just about barriers, it's about who knows how to break them. By morning, I decided I had to see for myself. I unlocked the safe using the backup key I had hidden in my coat lining. At first glance, everything was there. Dad's deed to the house, the old savings bonds, and the copies of the trust papers I had kept since he passed. But as I ran my hands over the envelopes, I felt the difference. They weren't aligned as I'd left them. Corners bent the wrong way, a manila folder pulled forward just enough to notice. It wasn't what was missing. It was the knowledge that someone had looked. I whispered to myself, "Am I paranoid, or is paranoia the only thing keeping me alive?" I shut the safe, but didn't feel safe at all. Later that afternoon, I thought of the bottle I'd saved from dinner, the one that had tasted strange. I had tucked it behind cookbooks in my kitchen cabinet, certain it would help me if I needed evidence. But when I reached up, my hand found only dust. The bottle was gone. There was no sign of a break-in. The windows were latched, the doors untouched. Whoever had been here hadn't forced their way inside. They had a key. Only one person came to mind. Silara. That evening, I called her, pretending it was a casual check-in. She answered with her usual breezy tone. "Hey Mars, what's up?" I kept my voice steady. "Did you stop by the house yesterday? I thought I noticed something different." There was a pause, too short for most people to notice, but I did. Then she laughed. "Of course not. Why would I? I've been swamped at work all week." Her casual denial slid over me like oil on water. "Right," I said lightly, though my chest burned. "Just making sure." "Don't be paranoid, Mars," she added sweetly. "You've always had an imagination." I forced a chuckle. Maybe so. But inside, my suspicion hardened into something sharper. If you want to kill someone, you don't leave fingerprints. You use familiarity as your weapon. That night, as I sat on my couch staring at my phone, I remembered a line from Maya Angelou. "When people show you who they are, believe them the first time." And Silara had been showing me for years. Her manipulation disguised as sisterly advice, her dismissive smirks when I caught her lies. I wanted to call her out, to shout into the phone that I knew what she was doing, but proof was too thin. So I told myself, watch, record, let them dig their own graves. The following days made ordinary moments feel sinister. When we met for coffee, her phone buzzed nonstop, and every time she excused herself to answer, she walked out of earshot. Dorian smirked at me over the rim of his glass whenever I refused his offers of a drink, as if amused by my caution. They wanted me off balance, they wanted me doubting my own instincts, but I refused to give them that satisfaction. I began noting details like a detective in my own home. Lights left on when I knew I had turned them off. A chair pulled slightly away from the table, and always that nagging sense of being studied like prey. Late one night, as I lay in bed with the lamp on, I heard whispers outside my door. At first, I thought it was the wind funneling through the eaves, but then words took shape. I held my breath, straining. One phrase reached me, clear as glass. "Once she signs." My blood ran cold. I pressed my ear against the wood of my bedroom door, barely breathing. The voices outside weren't muffled enough. It was them, Silara and Dorian. At first, the words came in broken fragments, shuffling of feet, hushed tones meant to stay secret, but one phrase sliced through as clear as if they had whispered it into my ear. Once she signs. I gripped the edge of the dresser to steady myself. There it was, confirmation. This wasn't my imagination spinning wild stories. It was an agenda, deliberate and planned. Blood may be thicker than water, but poison runs thicker than both. I didn't move until their footsteps retreated down the hall. My heartbeat stayed fast even after silence filled the space. I sat on the edge of the bed, staring at the shadows crawling along the floor, every nerve in my body braced as if danger was already inside my room. That paralysis lingered well into the night. My palms were damp, my chest tight. It was the same fear I remembered from childhood, standing outside closed doors while Solara whispered with her friends, laughing, plotting games I was never allowed to join. Back then, exclusion hurt. Now, exclusion could kill. She hasn't changed, I whispered to myself. Only the stakes have. I lay awake, listening to the walls, wondering how long they would keep circling me. The next morning, I forced myself out of bed and into the kitchen. The smell of pancakes reached me before I saw Solara at the stove. She turned, smiling too brightly. "You know, you should rest more," she chirped. "You look pale." I forced a smile, sliding into the chair. Strange, I slept fine. Maybe it's just what I ate. Her eyes lingered on me, and the sweetness in her tone was syrup poured over venom. Dorian sat at the table, tapping his phone, his smirk barely hidden as he sipped coffee. "Mars," Solara said, setting a plate in front of me. "You worry too much. You need to let go a little, live a little." My fork clinked against the plate. "I've learned living carefully isn't the same as living in fear." She laughed lightly, the sound hollow. "If you say so." I pushed the food around without tasting it, my stomach too tight. In America, we say if it looks too good to be true, it probably is. That applied to my sister's sudden kindness more than ever. Every gesture she made that day carried weight. A cup of tea sat a little too close to me, a casual pat on my shoulder that lingered. Her words of concern, as though rehearsed. I began to see not a sister, but an actress perfecting her lines. So I chose silence as my ally. I didn't confront. I didn't accuse. I decided instead to watch, to remember every detail. Silence, I reminded myself, is sometimes the best weapon. It forces the enemy to reveal themselves. That evening, dinner was a show. My mother talked about a neighbor's health scare. Solara laughed too often, her hand always brushing against Dorian's. Dorian himself was charm embodied, leaning back, telling stories about his clients, his voice smooth and polished. I sat quietly, studying, watching his fingers tap against his glass, the way his gaze slid toward me like a challenge. When he offered to pour me wine, I shook my head. "No, thank you. Headache." His brow arched, just slightly. "One glass won't hurt?" I met his eyes steadily. "I'll pass." For a heartbeat, silence fell across the table, broken only by the scrape of a fork. Then Solara laughed, light and airy. "Mars has always been cautious," she told Dorian, though her glance at me was sharp as a knife. I lowered my gaze, letting them think I was retreating, but inside, I was noting every crack, every slip. Later that night, I checked the safe again. My hands trembled as I lifted the envelope holding Dad's deed. It was just as I'd feared. The papers had shifted even more, as though someone had gone back, digging deeper, hungrier. This was no longer a vague suspicion gnawing at my mind. It was undeniable. I wasn't just imagining. I was being targeted. I sat in the car outside my mother's house longer than I should have, hands gripping the steering wheel until the leather warmed beneath my palms. I didn't want to walk in, didn't want to see their faces again, but I forced myself. Sometimes you sit at a table not to eat, but to study the players. That was exactly what I intended to do. The dining room was the same as ever. Dad's portrait still hanging crooked on the wall, the oak table polished to a shine, candles flickering even though the evening light was still spilling through the curtains. But the warmth was gone. Laughter filled the space, yet every chuckle sounded rehearsed. My mother talked about the neighbors, Solara giggled too loudly at nothing, and Dorian's smile stretched across the table like a blade. I placed my napkin on my lap and listened, waiting. Halfway through the meal, Dorian rose and picked up the bottle of wine. His movements were slow, deliberate. "This one's smooth," he said, as he tilted the glass toward me, pouring until it nearly brimmed. "You'll love it." I glanced at Solara, catching her eyes on me, too sharp, too focused, as if waiting for me to fail an exam only she knew about. "Don't be rude, Marcy," she coaxed with that polished smile she saved for guests. "He's trying to be generous." I lifted the glass, let the stem rest cool against my fingers. Inside my head, words sharpened. Generosity tastes like poison when you can't trust the hands offering it. I raised it slowly, tilting just enough to wet my lips, but I didn't swallow. Instead, I let the liquid linger before setting it back on the table. Dorian's eyes flicked toward me, expecting more. "Come on, it's a toast." "I'm pacing myself," I replied lightly, smiling as though nothing weighed on me. Inside, my decision was set. You won't catch me twice. The conversation stumbled but resumed. Solara leaned into Dorian, laughing too loud at a joke that wasn't funny. My mother glanced between us, sensing the undercurrent but unwilling to touch it. I kept my fork moving, mouth tight, heart steadying itself. In America, we often toast to health, but what if the toast itself is the sickness? The performance ended after dessert. I excused myself early, leaving the wine glass untouched on the table. My mother kissed my cheek, worry flickering in her eyes. Solara's goodbye hug was too tight, her perfume cloying, her whispered, "Sleep well," more command than blessing. Later that week, Tavian, a friend I trusted more than my own blood, sent me a text that lit up my phone. "Mars, you won't believe this. He wasn't alone." I called him immediately. "What do you mean?" "I was at a bar downtown," he said. "Dorian was there. He wasn't with your sister. He was leaning into some woman like he'd known her for years." My throat tightened. "Describe it." "He had his hand on her arm, whispering into her ear. She laughed, leaned into him. It wasn't business, Mars. It was personal." I closed my eyes, gripping the counter as his words sank in. So it wasn't just my assets. He collected secrets, women, and money the same way. When I hung up, fury coursed through me. Dorian wasn't just dangerous, he was reckless, and Solara wasn't blind. She had chosen to overlook it because convenience mattered more than loyalty. That realization burned hotter than fear. I sat by the window that night, connecting the dots. Dorian's subtle attempts to weaken me, Solara's complicity at every turn, and now his infidelity laid bare. They weren't bound by love, they were bound by opportunity. Trust, once broken, is like shattered glass. You can piece it back together, but you'll still bleed. I repeated that to myself until my resolve hardened. I wouldn't sit back any longer. Watching was not enough. The plan forming in my mind wasn't loud, wasn't impulsive. It was measured, strategic. Silence had been my shield, but it was becoming my sword. I would let them think I was blind, naive, predictable. All the while, I would set my pieces on the board carefully, quietly. That night, I walked past the untouched glass of wine still sitting on my kitchen counter. Its surface caught the light, red and glistening, promising danger with every ripple. I stopped, leaned in close, and whispered, "If you think I'm blind, you've underestimated me." Silence had become my shield, but I realized that silence alone would not protect me forever. Sitting in my living room after the dinner, staring at the untouched wine glass I had carried home as proof of my suspicions, I understood that watching without recording was as good as being blind. If they wanted me paranoid, I would become something else entirely. Calculated. So I went to the store the next morning, walked through aisles as if shopping for ordinary things, and slipped a small camera into my basket. Later, at home, I installed it carefully in the living room. I chose a high corner shelf, angling it toward the kitchen and the hallway leading to my study. I adjusted the lens twice, made sure it blended in. The house looked the same, but now it had an eye. My eye. In America, we say trust but verify, I murmured to myself as I tested the view on my phone. Well, I'm done with trust. Now, it's all verification. Every time I left the house after that, I checked the feed, comforted and unnerved all at once by the ability to see what I wasn't supposed to. Days later, I sat cross-legged on my bed, scrolling through hours of nothing. Empty rooms, shifting light, the hum of a house pretending to be ordinary. And then, one clip froze me. There was Dorian, alone in my kitchen. He had let himself in as if he belonged there. He walked to the counter, uncorked a bottle with deliberate calm, and with a flick of his fingers, dropped something into the glass. He swirled it once, watching it dissolve before raising the rim as though admiring his own handiwork. My body went cold. I played it again, and again. His posture didn't waver. His expression didn't falter. He knew exactly what he was doing. So it wasn't my imagination, I whispered into the silence of my bedroom. He wanted me weakened. And Solara knew. Rage rippled through me, but I pressed it down, locking it inside my chest. Confronting him now would be useless. They'd laugh, call me paranoid, deny everything. Evidence mattered more than anger. I thought of the news stories that cycle through American television every year. Young women drugged at bars, their lives upended because they trusted the wrong drink. We're told to watch our glasses, to guard them like treasures, to never accept one from a stranger. But no one warns you what to do when the glass comes from your sister's fiancé at your own family's table. That evening, as if the universe wanted to drive the knife deeper, my phone buzzed with a message from an unknown number. The text glowed like fire against the dark screen. Don't drink what he gives you. My throat tightened. For a moment, I couldn't move. Someone else knew. Someone had seen. I leaned forward, tapping my fingers against the desk. Justice moves slow, I whispered, recalling a phrase I once heard. But preparation moves fast. I knew then that simply watching would no longer be enough. Protecting myself required more than hidden cameras and silence. It required something they couldn't laugh off, something binding, something legal. I picked up my phone, staring at the anonymous message still glowing in my thread. My reflection stared back at me from the dark screen. If you think I'm defenseless, I whispered into the quiet room, you've just given me my first ally. After the anonymous warning flashed across my phone, I sat in the dark for a long time. The glow of that single sentence burned into my eyes. Don't drink what he gives you. I had already seen the footage from my hidden camera. I had already tasted the bitterness in the glass. But now, with someone else confirming it, my silence suddenly felt like a noose around my neck. I thought about it over and over. In chess, you can't just defend, you must plan the counterattack. The truth was, fear of being dismissed had kept me still. What if no one believed me? What if I was told again, you're too sensitive, Marceline? But the fear of saying nothing, of waiting until it was too late, was heavier. I remembered reading statistics about women who never reported until it was past saving, and how often they said later, I wish I had prepared. That became the voice in my head as I picked up my phone and searched for a lawyer. Preparation wasn't cowardice, it was survival. 2 days later, I pushed open the glass door of a law office in downtown Portland. Outside, gray skies pressed low, the kind that make the city feel smaller. Inside, the walls were sterile, lined with certificates. The air smelled faintly of old books and disinfectant. I introduced myself to Clareth Vion, a man in his early 50s with steady eyes and a calm presence. He gestured for me to sit. I need help, I began, voice low. I think my sister's fiancé is drugging me. His expression didn't change. No shock, no disbelief, just quiet listening. Tell me what you've seen, he said. I told him about the wine, the missing bottle, the whispers outside my door, the footage on my camera. When I finished, he folded his hands. If you're right, he said firmly, you don't have time to hesitate. If you're wrong, preparation won't hurt you. Either way, protect yourself now. His words landed heavy. If you're a day too late, he added, you'll lose everything. I sat back, swallowing the tightness in my throat. Fear solidified into clarity. I nodded once. Then let's begin. We moved into details. He laid out options, trusts, power of attorney, notarizations. He spoke in a steady rhythm, explaining how assets could be shifted without raising alarms, how to shield what was mine from legal reach. That afternoon, I signed documents I never imagined I'd need. Paperwork that once symbolized family, home, inheritance, savings, now became walls of defense. My signature curved across the pages like a quiet rebellion. The notary stamped each one, the sound sharp in the still office. I pressed my pen down firmly, as though each stroke was severing ties. In America, I thought, we sign papers to protect homes and futures. For me, it felt like signing a divorce from my own blood. When the last signature dried, I exhaled slowly. Leaving the office, I carried the stack of documents in a folder against my chest. I walked out to my car, slid into the driver's seat, and didn't start the engine right away. The papers stared at me from the passenger seat, as if they knew the weight they carried. Shame gnawed at me. Shame for needing protection from my sister, for dragging my mother unknowingly into this fight. Guilt for thinking of Dad's legacy not as a gift, but as bait they wanted to steal. I heard Lincoln's words echo in memory. You cannot escape the responsibility of tomorrow by evading it today. I whispered it aloud, gripping the steering wheel. I had taken responsibility, but it felt like cutting a cord that bound me to the family I thought I had. By evening, I returned home. The house was still, the kind of stillness that reminds you of what's missing. On the counter, the untouched wine glass from that dinner remained where I had left it. Its rim caught the dim light, glinting like a warning. I set the folder of documents beside it and leaned on the counter. Let them think I'm vulnerable, I whispered. They don't know I've already moved the ground beneath their feet. Later, in my bedroom, I locked the documents away in a new hiding place, deeper than before. As I slid the drawer shut, my phone buzzed. It was a message from Salara. We need to talk about family money. Tomorrow. I stared at the screen, my pulse steady now, not racing. This wasn't paranoia anymore. This was war. The text from Salara lingered on my phone all night. We need to talk about family money. Tomorrow. I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, replaying the words over and over. It wasn't a request. It was a summons. By morning, I knew I had to go, not because I trusted her, but because refusing would only fuel their narrative. The late afternoon rain tapped against the windows of the family dining room as I entered the house. The sound was steady, almost like a drum beat reminding me where I was. The air smelled faintly of lemon polish and damp earth, the way it always did when the storm rolled through Portland. Salara was already at the table, a folder in front of her. Dorian sat beside her, posture relaxed, but his smile too measured. I slid into the chair opposite them. My gut told me this wasn't a conversation. It was another setup. In America, family meetings about money rarely end with hugs. They end with signatures. Salara pushed the folder across the table. This is a plan to simplify things, she said smoothly. I opened it, scanning the typed lines, combining accounts, joint authority, pooled management. It was written like a safety net, but smelled like a noose. If we combine assets under one account, we'll protect each other, Salara said, her voice dripping with rehearsed sincerity. Dorian leaned forward, his tone buttery. It's just practical. Trust me, this will make life easier. Trust. That word again. My face stayed calm, but inside, fury burned. Trust is the last word I believe from your lips. He slid a pen toward me. All it takes is your signature. I held the pen lightly, studying the words in front of me. Every predator reveals its teeth when it smells submission. Let them think I'm soft. Minutes ticked by. I traced the lines on the paper, my silence heavy. Salara's mask cracked slightly. She tapped her fingers against the table, impatience edging her voice. What's the problem, Mars? This protects you as much as it does us. I looked up slowly. It's thorough, I said, tone neutral. Dorian smirked, certain he had me. But in my head, the words repeated. It wasn't a proposal. It was a trap disguised as paperwork. I set the folder down gently. My pulse quickened as I leaned in. The subject line read, Next steps. The The sender, Dorian. The recipient, Solara. I forced myself to breathe evenly as I read. Once she's out, we'll use her money to start our company. The words hit like ice water down my spine. Not whispered this time, not veiled, typed out in plain English, neat and unashamed, as though plotting my erasure was just another business plan. I whispered to myself, sometimes betrayal isn't whispered, it's typed, stored, and sent like any other deal. I scrolled further. Deadlines, account numbers, references to assets I recognized, my assets. The dates aligned with the very meeting Solara had invited me to, her family talks. They weren't planning for a family future, I muttered under my breath. They were planning my erasure. I screenshot everything, hands steady despite the tremor in my chest. I saved copies to the cloud, then slid a USB into the side of the laptop and saved again. Redundancy was my ally now. I sat back, staring at the glow of the screen. Part of me felt shattered, stripped bare by the reality of their scheme. Another part of me felt vindicated. Proof was no longer a whisper or suspicion. It was in black and white. Justice doesn't need volume, I murmured. It needs proof. But I wasn't done. I opened the folder of hidden camera footage, scrolling through days of recordings. At first, the scenes were ordinary. Dorian pacing across the living room, Solara opening drawers she had no reason to touch. But then, a gap, a hole in the timeline where video should have been. Files don't vanish on their own. Someone had tampered with my eyes. My stomach clenched as I clicked again, fast-forwarding until a frozen frame appeared, Dorian glancing directly at the camera. A beat later, the feed cut to black. My pulse raced, blood rushing in my ears. I had thought I was the watcher. But no, I was being watched too. I'm not one step ahead anymore, I whispered. I'm toe-to-toe with predators. The violations sank deep. They knew I had been recording, and instead of fleeing, they stared me down through the lens. That night, I thought about every headline I'd read about hacked cameras, stolen footage, the fear of privacy ripped away. The violation wasn't just physical anymore, it was psychological. But predators evolve, and so do survivors. The next morning, I drove across town, bought another hidden camera. I placed it in a new spot, one even I barely noticed after setting it up. I added a second USB drive, hidden in a lockbox under floorboards. If they tampered again, they wouldn't know what I had doubled. I stared at my reflection in the mirror, the lines of exhaustion cutting deeper into my face. No more waiting, I told myself. I'm done being the hunted. That evening, I closed my laptop, sliding the USB into my pocket like a talisman. I stood by the window, staring out at the driveway, the street lamp casting pale light over the wet pavement. Then I saw it, a shadow lingering near the driveway, still as stone. Too tall to be the neighbor's kid, too intent to be a passerby. By the time I blinked, it was gone. The storm wasn't coming. It was already here. After seeing the erased footage and reading the emails, I knew the time for shadows was ending. They would move boldly soon, because predators grow desperate when cornered. And desperation makes them sloppy. I had no illusions left. Solara and Dorian weren't waiting. They were hunting. That night, I sat at my kitchen table with my phone angled against a coffee mug, testing the camera. I needed proof, not words. The plan was simple. If they tried again, I would let them believe I'd taken the bait. My lips would touch the rim of the glass, but nothing would ever cross my throat. My phone would record every second. Trust is earned in drops, but lost in buckets, I whispered, repeating an old saying. They had drained their bucket long ago. What remained for me was preparation. Calm, deliberate, relentless. The next family dinner felt different before it even began. The house hummed with tension. My mother tried to keep conversation light, talking about the garden, about church, but her words fell flat against the silence pressing from the other side of the table. Dorian reached for a bottle I hadn't seen before. He poured a deep red into a single glass, mine. He lifted it, smiling with practiced ease. To new beginnings, he said, voice steady but eyes too intent. Solara, seated at his side, raised her own glass with a tight smile. To family. I raised mine, meeting both of their gazes. The glass tilted just enough for the wine to touch my lips, but I let it slip down the side unnoticed, staining the napkin in my lap. My pulse stayed steady, but inside I repeated to myself, "This isn't a toast. It's an execution masked in a smile." Later, when I reviewed the recording on my phone, I saw what I'd expected. The hidden angle caught Dorian earlier in the evening, sliding a small tablet into the glass before filling it halfway. He swirled it once, confident, unhurried. Silent fury burned in my chest. Resolve replaced fear. The evidence was mine now. At the table, I leaned back, feigning ease. A few minutes later, I touched my temple, pretending to wince. "You okay?" Silara asked, her tone a mix of fake concern and sharp curiosity. "I think it's just the wine hitting me," I murmured, letting my eyelids droop slightly. Dorian's eyes flickered, and I caught it. Eager expectation. They were waiting for me to fall. Inside, my thoughts cut sharp. They're waiting for me to collapse. They don't know I'm already standing above them. I kept the act believable, moving slower, sipping only water the rest of the night. I let them believe their plan was unfolding. Their smiles grew too confident, their conversation too light. They thought they had me where they wanted. But silence, once again, was my ally. Later that night, after I returned home, my phone buzzed with a message from Tavian. "Call me, urgent." When I answered, his voice was clipped. "Mars, a buddy of mine was at a bar downtown. He caught Dorian running his mouth. He recorded it." I frowned. "What did he say?" Tavian hesitated. "I'm sending it to you. Just listen." Minutes later, a file came through. I pressed play. The bar's noise filled my ears, glasses clinking, laughter, music in the background. Then Dorian's voice, slurred but clear. "She won't even know what hit her. Once she signs, it's all ours." The woman beside him laughed, encouraging. He leaned closer to the recorder unknowingly. "We'll bleed her out the easy way. Paperwork does the job better than poison." I stopped the recording, staring at the phone as if it might catch fire in my hand. Exhilaration and horror collided in my chest. Proof, from his own mouth, layered on top of the footage and the emails. I whispered to myself, in this country, people think bars are for forgetting, but sometimes bars remember for you. That night, I laid everything out like a puzzle on my desk. One folder for each piece of evidence. Video of Dorian spiking my drink, the email chain plotting to drain my assets, the drunken confession recorded in a Portland bar. I made copies, one cloud, one USB, one hidden envelope tucked inside my mother's attic. Each piece was a nail in the coffin they had built for themselves. I leaned back, inhaling deeply. Proof is power, and power is the only language they understand. For the first time in weeks, the fear receded. Confidence filled the hollow it left behind. I slid the USB into my pocket, pressing my palm against it like armor. "They wanted me weak," I said softly to the empty room. "Instead, they made me unbreakable." The next time we sat at the table, I knew it wouldn't be dinner. It would be war. The day of the so-called family meeting arrived, and I walked into my mother's house knowing it wasn't about family at all. It was about power, and about stripping me of mine. Rain pattered against the windows, the late autumn air damp and heavy. The dining room smelled faintly of lemon polish, as if Silara had worked hard to cover the rot with a shine. Silara sat at the head of the table, her smile stretched thin. Dorian leaned back in his chair, arrogant and calm, as though the outcome was already in his pocket. Their confidence didn't rattle me. I had rehearsed this moment in my mind too many times to count. They thought I was cornered, I reminded myself silently. But they never saw the walls already caving in on them. I placed my bag on the floor and sat down slowly, folding my hands in front of me. My heart was steady. This was the battlefield I had prepared for. Silara's eyes gleamed as she slid a folder toward me. "We just need your cooperation, Mars. Then we can all move forward." I reached into my bag and pulled out a sealed envelope. Without a word, I slid it across the table. She tore it open quickly, expecting signatures. Instead, her eyes narrowed as she read the note aloud. "This is the last thing you'll ever touch with my name on it." Her chair screeched against the wood floor as she stood abruptly. "You can't do this. You're family." "Family doesn't drug each other," I replied coldly. My voice didn't rise, but the weight of my words filled the room. Dorian stiffened, jaw tightening. He didn't speak, and that silence was louder than any denial. The betrayal crystallized into a cold rejection. For years, I had longed for them to admit what they were doing. Now I no longer needed words. I had proof. Silara's voice broke into a shriek. "You've lost your mind. You're paranoid, hysterical. You've always been fragile, and now you're just proving it." I let her rant, my gaze steady. Inside, my thoughts turned sharp. They used to laugh at my silence. Now silence is the weapon cutting them down. Dorian's silence pressed heavier. His eyes flicked to me, then away, betraying that he knew I had the evidence. I leaned back, speaking softly. "You wanted my compliance. What you have is my refusal. And it's final." Silara suddenly softened, dropping back into her chair, smoothing her blouse as if trying to erase the tantrum. Her voice turned syrupy. "Let's not fight anymore, Mars. We're sisters." She rose and moved toward me, arms open for a hug. My mother, sitting quietly at the edge, looked relieved at this sudden display of peace. But I saw it clearly. Her arms weren't for love. The screen kept lighting up in my hand, screaming for my attention. I placed it face down on the kitchen table and walked away. Once, I would have answered every call from family, even if it meant hearing things I didn't want to. But now, silence was my only reply. The quiet pressed heavy around me, yet it was steadying. Their frantic calls weren't evidence of their power. They were proof of their unraveling. I brewed tea, sat by the window, and listened to the rain against the glass. My heart wasn't racing anymore. It was steady, slow. For the first time, I didn't feel hunted. I felt untouchable. The next morning, the calls didn't stop, but they were joined by a flood of voicemails. I listened to the first one with curiosity, not dread. Silara's voice cracked with sobs. "We can fix this, Mars. Don't ruin us. Just call me back, please." I played the second, Dorian's voice, sharp, biting. "You'll regret this if you don't call me back. You think you're clever, but you can't outsmart us forever." The third was different again, Silara whispering like a child. "I made mistakes, but we're sisters. Don't do this to me." I leaned back, letting the words wash over me. I didn't feel rage anymore, only a cold observation, as if I were a scientist studying specimens in a glass jar. This was gaslighting in its purest form. Threats, guilt, sudden tenderness, cycling through each tone until they found one that broke me. But I was done being guilty. Later that day, my mother came by. She had heard fragments of Silara's breakdown through a mutual friend. When she stepped into my living room, she looked tired, older than she had the week before. "I didn't want to believe my own daughter could be so cruel," she said softly, sitting across from me. I reached across the table and took her hand. "It took me too long to see it too, Mom. But we're here now." Her eyes brimmed with tears. "You're stronger than I thought. Stronger than I ever was." "Blood doesn't make family," I said gently. "Loyalty does." For the first time in years, the bond between us felt whole again, as if the fractures carved by Silara's manipulation had healed. My mother was my anchor, and I was hers. That evening, the storm of calls returned, my phone buzzing like an insect trapped in a jar. I didn't ignore them this time. I pressed record and saved every voicemail, one after another, as evidence of harassment. The threats, the sobbing, the alternating voices, it was all part of the same cage they had built. Only now, the cage was theirs. When I finished, I switched the phone to silent, placed it in a drawer, and turned the key in the lock. Their voices could scream, cry, or curse, but they couldn't touch me anymore. Americans often talk about boundaries as something we struggle with most inside families. Drawing them feels cruel, even when necessary. But that night, as I locked the drawer, I understood the empowerment of saying enough. I sat back on my couch, exhaling. The fear that had once filled my chest was gone. In its place was something harder, calmer, control. I thought about Maya Angelou's words. You may not control all the events that happen to you, but you can decide not to be reduced by them. I repeated it to myself like a prayer. The suspicion, the paranoia, the constant second-guessing of the past months, all of it had led here, to liberation. My life was mine again, unchained from their grip. By morning, I woke without dread. The phone stayed silent in the drawer. My tea tasted sweeter than it had in months. Stepping outside, the cold Portland air bit my cheeks, but it felt fresh, clean. I closed my eyes and let it settle into me. The missed calls weren't my burden, I whispered to myself. They were their echo of failure. But echoes fade, and in their silence, I began to rebuild. After I shut the drawer on my silent phone, the air in my house felt different, lighter, though my body was still carrying weeks of exhaustion. My mother arrived the next morning, her umbrella dripping rainwater in the entryway. She hung her coat, took one look at me, and sighed. "Mars," she said, voice softer than I'd heard in a long time. "I should have seen it sooner. They weren't protecting you. They were circling you." I set a mug of tea in front of her and sat across the table. It took me losing trust to finally gain my freedom. Her eyes met mine. Guilt and strength mixed in equal measure. I believed her when she said you were imagining things. That's on me. But I see now. The words hit me with bittersweet relief. Reconciliation washed through the room, and I let myself lean into it. For so long, I'd felt like I was screaming into silence. Now her voice was proof that truth can't be buried forever. "We can't choose family," I said, reaching across to squeeze her hand, "but we can choose which voices to carry forward." She nodded slowly, tears brimming. For the first time, I felt like she wasn't looking at me as the youngest daughter who needed protecting. She saw me as someone who had already saved herself. Later that day, she told me something I hadn't known. "Solara came to me before. She said you were paranoid, unstable. She tried to make me believe you were unraveling." I leaned back, unsurprised, but still struck by the venom of it. "Projection," I muttered. "Yes," my mother said firmly. She was the one unraveling. I folded my arms. The louder they shout, the more guilty they are. Her face tightened, but not with disbelief, this time with solidarity. Her voice restored balance to the family story that had been twisted for too long. That evening, while my mother cooked soup in the kitchen, I checked my phone. One final voicemail waited for me. I pressed play. Solara's voice cracked and ragged. "We just wanted what's ours!" I closed my eyes. That wasn't a plea. It was a confession, an epitaph. Proof that all of this had never been about love, about family. It had been about entitlement. I whispered, "Greed writes its own confession." Calm washed over me, not triumph, but certainty. I saved the message alongside the others, adding it to the archive. Emails, videos, recordings, every shred of proof. My lawyer later confirmed what I already knew. They had no claim left. My assets were untouchable. They wanted my silence as weakness, I thought, filing the USB away. I made it my strength. It wasn't revenge shouted in a courtroom. It was permanence. They could not undo what I had secured. In the weeks that followed, my mother and I began to reclaim the house. We painted the walls, replaced curtains that still smelled faintly of Solara's perfume, and rearranged furniture that had once been placed with her approval. As we rolled paint over the walls, my mother laughed for the first time in months. "This feels like taking the house back," she said. I dipped my brush, smiling. "It is. It always was ours." I thought of Eleanor Roosevelt's words. "No one can make you feel inferior without your consent." For too long, I had handed over that consent. Not anymore. Rebuilding didn't mean erasing the past. It meant reclaiming the present. I planted flowers in the garden my father once tended. My mother hung new curtains in the kitchen. Every act was a small declaration. We survived, and we would thrive. One morning, I stepped outside into the Portland air. The sun had returned, cutting through the damp. My phone was off, tucked away for good. They wanted my life, I whispered to myself. All they got was my silence. And silence is forever.